Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a river somewhere in Southeast Asia approximately 50,000 years ago. On the other side of that river, which is maybe 200 meters wide and moving with the kind of confident authority that rivers have when they've been flowing for millennia and have no particular concern for your logistical problems, there is food. Good food. The kind of food, fruit, small game, plant resources, that makes crossing worthwhile. You could swim. Probably. You're a capable physical specimen by any measure, lean and strong from a life of constant movement. But the river is fast. The far bank is far, and somewhere in that dark water, something with a lot of teeth has been making the fishing excellent for the crocodiles who don't have your particular transportation problem. You look at the water, you look at the food on the other side, you look at the water again, and then you notice something that has been there all along, bobbing at the river's edge with the cheerful indifference of an object that has no idea it's about to become one of the most consequential technologies in human history. A fallen tree trunk, thick and buoyant, turning slowly in the current at the bank. You wade in, you grab it, you discover that with the log under your arms, the water that was previously trying to take you somewhere downstream at speed is now manageable. You kick, you cross, you eat. You have just had the foundational insight from which all of human maritime history eventually unfolds. And while that moment left no archaeological trace, and while the person who had it is utterly unknown and will remain so forever, what followed from it, across thousands of years of incremental innovation, expanding ambition, and the particular human combination of curiosity and necessity, eventually produced vessels that crossed the Pacific, circumnavigated the globe, and carried civilizations to continents they hadn't known existed. The story of how ancient humans invented the boat is the story of how the simplest possible observation became the most consequential transportation technology in the history of our species. The foundational observation, that certain objects float and can support human weight in water, requires no invention and no particular intelligence beyond what any mammal that lives near water quickly develops through experience. Logs float. Bundles of reeds float. Inflated animal skins float. The physical principle involved, buoyancy, the displacement of water by a less dense object, was not a discovery that required abstract thinking. It was a direct perceptual observation available to any animal that had experience with water and floating objects. What made early humans different from other animals that observed this phenomenon was the capacity to deliberately exploit the observation, to intentionally use a floating object as a transport aid rather than simply noting that it floated and moving on. The cognitive step from "that thing floats" to "I can use that thing to cross this water" is the fundamental innovation, and it is a step that requires the kind of means-ends reasoning that early Homo sapiens possessed in abundance. The earliest form of watercraft that can be reasonably inferred from this observation is the simplest possible. A natural object, unmodified, used as a buoyancy aid for swimming. A person holding onto a log while kicking through water is not using a boat in any meaningful technological sense, but they are using the principle of buoyancy in a deliberate, instrumental way that contains the germ of everything that follows. This behavior leaves no archaeological trace, is almost certainly far older than any physical evidence of watercraft, and probably predates anatomically modern Homo sapiens entirely. The important archaeological evidence doesn't come from physical boats. Organic materials rarely survive tens of thousands of years under the conditions where boats would have been used and stored, but from the biogeographical record of where humans were and when. The most dramatic such evidence concerns the colonization of Australia. Australia was never connected to mainland Asia during any period when anatomically modern humans existed. The minimum sea crossing required to reach Australia from the nearest landmass, the islands of Wallacea in what is now Indonesia, was approximately 90 kilometers, even during periods of maximum sea level reduction, during glacial cycles when more land was exposed. This crossing across open ocean out of sight of land for a significant portion of the route could not have been made accidentally. It required intentional water crossing using some form of watercraft. The presence of humans in Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, and potentially earlier based on contested evidence, means that deliberate ocean crossing was occurring at this early date. This is not the casual river crossing from the opening scenario. This is open ocean navigation, out of sight of the destination, requiring watercraft capable of supporting multiple people over an extended crossing time, and presumably the navigational knowledge to maintain direction across open water without landmarks. The Australian colonization event is the most dramatic evidence for early watercraft use, but it is not the only evidence. The colonization of islands in the Mediterranean by early modern humans, the presence of humans on islands in Southeast Asia at very early dates, and the broader pattern of human dispersal through island environments all require watercraft. The sea was not, for early modern humans, an absolute barrier in the way that it is for most terrestrial mammals. It was a challenge that was being overcome with technology that has left no direct physical trace, but whose existence is proven by the undeniable fact of where humans were. The physical evidence for early watercraft, actual preserved examples or unambiguous depictions, enters the archaeological record considerably later than the behavioral evidence suggests boats must have existed. The oldest confirmed watercraft in the physical archaeological record is the Pesse canoe, found in the Netherlands and dated to approximately 8000 BCE, roughly 10,000 years ago. It is a dugout canoe, a log with the interior hollowed out through controlled burning and chopping to create a hull. At approximately 3 meters long, it is a functional small watercraft capable of carrying 1 or 2 people on calm inland waters. The Pesse canoe is not the oldest boat that existed. It is the oldest boat that has been found, which is a very different statement. Organic material preservation over thousands of years is rare and requires unusual conditions, waterlogging, extreme dryness, or other environmental factors that prevent the bacterial decomposition that normally reduces wood to nothing within decades. The vast majority of watercraft made over tens of thousands of years of human history are simply gone, leaving no trace. The boat-building traditions that produced the Pesse canoe were almost certainly thousands of years old by the time that particular canoe was made. The craftsmanship visible in the Pesse canoe, the controlled interior removal, the shaping of the hull profile, implies a tradition with accumulated knowledge about what works and what doesn't, not a first attempt by someone who had never seen a boat before. The dugout canoe represents the first major technological development beyond the simple buoyancy aid, and understanding how it was developed illuminates the character of ancient innovation more broadly. A log is buoyant and can support weight. A person lying across a log or holding onto it can cross water. But a log in this raw form has problems. It rolls. It sits high in the water with poor stability, and it provides no way to sit above the waterline comfortably. Riding a round log through any significant water movement is an exercise in continuously falling off something that doesn't particularly want to be ridden. The insight that removing material from the interior of the log, converting it from a solid cylinder to a hollow hull, solves multiple problems simultaneously is not obvious from the outside. Intuitively, removing material from a floating object might seem to reduce its buoyancy. What actually happens is more interesting. Hollowing the log lowers the center of gravity, dramatically improves stability, creates a sitting space that positions the occupant inside rather than on top of the craft, and allows the craft to ride lower and more stably in the water. The hollowed log is a dramatically better watercraft than the solid log, in ways that aren't predictable without experiencing them. How did early humans discover this? Almost certainly through observation and accidental encounter. Hollow logs float and are common in river environments. A naturally hollow log encountered at a riverbank would have demonstrated the stability and handling properties that solid logs lacked. It sits differently in water, is easier to balance on, and has the interior space that makes boarding and riding more practical. The observation that hollow is better than solid for riding on water could come from encountering natural hollow logs floating in river environments, and the subsequent intentional production of hollow logs for watercraft use would follow from that observation. The technology of controlled interior removal, using fire and stone tools to hollow a log to a consistent wall thickness without burning through the hull, required the development of craft knowledge about how fire burns wood, how stone tools cut across in a long grain, and how to maintain even removal around the interior while preserving the structural integrity of the walls. This is genuinely skilled work, not trivially accomplished even with knowledge of the goal. The development of reliable dugout construction technique almost certainly involved a long period of trial, failure, and progressive refinement that left no archaeological trace. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The reed bundle boat represents a parallel, and in some environments earlier development than the dugout canoe, and it illustrates how different ecological contexts drove different solutions to the same fundamental problem. In environments where large trees suitable for dugout construction were unavailable, desert river systems like the Nile, coastal environments in the Middle East and South America, highland lake environments, reed plants provided an alternative buoyancy material. Dense bundles of reeds, bound tightly together, have sufficient buoyancy to support substantial weight. The specific principle here is different from the hollow log hull. The reeds provide distributed buoyancy through the air trapped within their cellular structure and between the stems, rather than through hull displacement of a large air pocket. Reed bundle boats are documented archaeologically in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and along the Pacific coast of South America, and versions of this technology persist in a few locations into the modern era. The papyrus boats of Lake Tana in Ethiopia and the Tatara reed boats of Lake Titicaca in Peru and Bolivia are living examples of a craft tradition with deep roots. The construction technique, bundling reeds into a hull shape, binding the bundles tightly to maintain form, building up layers to achieve the desired displacement, is labor-intensive but requires no woodworking tools and can be accomplished entirely with plant fiber and stone-cutting tools to harvest the reeds. The reed boat demonstrates something important about ancient technological development. There was no single solution to the boat problem, no one correct answer that all ancient cultures converged on. Different environments provided different materials, and different materials led to different designs, each adapted to its ecological context. The diversity of ancient watercraft technologies, dugouts, reed bundles, bark boats, hide boats, plank boats, reflects the broader pattern of human innovation working with available materials rather than from a blueprint of what a boat should be. Bark canoes represent another independent solution developed in forest environments where bark could be stripped from trees in large sheets and worked into hull forms. The birch bark canoe of North American and Siberian traditions, the stringy bark canoe of Australian Aboriginal traditions, and various other bark hull traditions demonstrate that the physical property of tree bark, relatively waterproof, flexible enough to shape into hull forms, light and available in large pieces, made it an attractive hull material wherever appropriate tree species were available. The construction of a birch bark canoe, one of the most fully documented traditional watercraft technologies through both ethnographic and archaeological study, is a sophisticated craft involving the preparation of bark panels, the construction of a wooden frame to give the hull its shape, and the waterproofing of seams with pine pitch or other natural adhesives. The finished product is extraordinarily light for its load capacity and exceptionally maneuverable in shallow rivers and lakes. The North American birch bark canoe tradition produced vessels that European explorers found superior to their own watercraft for navigating the inland waterway systems of the continent. Lighter, shallower in draft, easier to portage around obstacles, and better adapted to the specific hydrological character of North American rivers. The bark canoe tradition in North America was ancient at the time of European contact, representing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about bark preparation, frame construction, seam sealing, and hull design. The knowledge was transmitted through craft apprenticeship, young people learning by observing and assisting experienced canoe builders, gradually developing the physical skills and material knowledge required for independent construction. This transmission system, common to all traditional craft technologies, meant that the accumulated improvements of many generations were preserved and built upon rather than repeatedly rediscovered. The transition from single-hull craft to outrigger designs represents one of the most important innovations in the history of watercraft, and it emerged in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions in ways that eventually enabled the most remarkable feat of human navigation in the ancient world. A single-hull canoe is limited in its stability by the width of its hull. Making the hull wider improves stability, but reduces speed and paddling efficiency. The outrigger, a float attached to the main hull by horizontal poles, solves this trade-off elegantly. The main hull can remain narrow and fast while the outrigger provides the lateral stability that prevents capsizing. The engineering insight is straightforward once you understand the physics of stability, but discovering it empirically requires the observation that attaching a secondary float changes the dynamic behavior of the main hull in ways that are disproportionately beneficial. The outrigger canoe became the primary craft technology of the Pacific Ocean peoples. The Austronesian-speaking populations who dispersed from Taiwan across Southeast Asia and ultimately across the Pacific to Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island in one of the most extraordinary episodes of maritime exploration in human history. The Lapita people, who carried the early Austronesian language and material culture across the Pacific, beginning approximately 3,500 years ago, accomplished this dispersal using outrigger canoes with the addition of sails, the combination that made long-distance open ocean navigation possible. The sail is the technology that extended human maritime range from river and coastal navigation to genuine ocean crossing. Before the sail, watercraft were limited by the endurance of the paddlers or oarsmen, a factor that constrained the distance achievable in a single voyage and the size of crew that could be practically sustained on long journeys. With the sail, the energy of wind replaced or supplemented human muscle, allowing longer voyages, larger vessels, and heavier cargo capacity. The invention of the sail is as difficult to pin to a precise moment as the invention of the hull, and for the same reason, the observation from which it developed was available in the environment long before it was deliberately exploited. Wind moves objects. A person standing in wind is pushed by it. A flat surface held perpendicular to wind is pushed more strongly than a person standing normally. These are direct physical experiences available to anyone who has stood in wind and held something flat. The conceptual leap from this experience to deliberately using a flat surface to capture wind energy and drive a watercraft is shorter than many of the leaps involved in other technological inventions, but it still required someone to make the connection between the force experience and the propulsion application. The oldest unambiguous depictions of sails appear in ancient Egyptian art dating to approximately 3400 BCE. Showing reed boats on the Nile with simple square sails made from woven plant fiber. These earliest sails were used downwind, positioned to catch wind from behind or the side, which is the simplest sailing configuration and requires the least understanding of aerodynamic principles. The wind pushes the sail and the sail pushes the boat, in the same direction as the wind. This works when the wind is blowing toward where you want to go, which on the Nile in Egypt was conveniently often the case. The prevailing wind blows south while the current flows north, allowing boats to sail upriver and drift downriver in a complementary pattern that made river traffic efficient in both directions. The development of sailing configurations that allowed progress against the wind, beating up wind by angling the sail and hull to generate aerodynamic lift, required a far more sophisticated understanding of wind-sail-hull interaction and came much later in sailing's development. The lateen sail, the fore and aft rigging, and the various configurations that allow modern sailing vessels to make progress in nearly any wind direction were the products of thousands of years of accumulated sailing experience, and incremental refinement by sailors working out, through direct practice and observation, what combinations of sail shape, angle, and hull design produced which results. The Austronesian expansion across the Pacific is the achievement that most forcefully demonstrates what ancient maritime technology, fully developed, was capable of, and examining it provides the most direct window into the cumulative sophistication of ancient boat building and navigation. The settlement of the remote Pacific Islands, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, and hundreds of smaller islands across millions of square kilometers of ocean, required navigating over distances of thousands of kilometers without any of the navigational instruments that modern maritime tradition considers basic. No magnetic compass, no sextant, no charts, no GPS or radio, or any external navigational aid. What Polynesian navigators possessed instead was a comprehensive empirical system of natural sign reading, accumulated over centuries of observation and transmitted through intensive apprenticeship. Stars. The rising and setting positions of specific stars and constellations that provided directional information, the way specific stars passed overhead at specific latitudes. Swells. The long-period ocean swells generated by distant weather systems that maintained consistent direction independent of local wind conditions, readable by experienced navigators through the motion of the hull and the patterns of water movement. Birds. The flight directions of specific species at specific times of day that indicated island proximity and direction. Clouds. The patterns of cloud formation over islands that differed from open ocean cloud behavior. Even bioluminescence. The patterns of planktonic light emission at night that experienced navigators read for information about current patterns. This navigational system was not intuitive or casually acquired. It required systematic training across years, deliberate instruction, and a tradition of knowledge transmission that preserved and accumulated observational knowledge across generations. The people who navigated across the Pacific to settle Hawaii and New Zealand were practitioners of a highly developed applied science, not in the Western academic sense, but in the sense of a systematic, empirically grounded, culturally transmitted body of knowledge that produced reliable results in the application it was designed for. The vessels they navigated in, double-hulled canoes, essentially two outrigger hulls connected by a platform, were the product of an equally sophisticated craft tradition, refined over centuries for the demands of open ocean crossings. The hull designs, sail rigging, lashing techniques, and structural engineering of these vessels represented accumulated craft knowledge that produced vessels capable of surviving the conditions of the open Pacific, storms, extreme wave action, extended periods at sea, with a reliability that enabled confident settlement voyages, not desperate gambles. The accumulated significance of boat invention for human history is difficult to overstate, and it operates at multiple scales simultaneously. At the most immediate level, watercraft transformed the movement of goods across the ancient world in ways that fundamentally changed the economic possibilities of every civilization with water access. Water transport of bulk goods is dramatically more energy efficient than land transport for equivalent loads, a fact that ancient civilizations exploited extensively. The grain trade that sustained ancient Mediterranean civilizations, the copper and tin trade that supplied Bronze Age metallurgy across the Near East and Europe, the silk and spice trade that connected Asia to the Mediterranean, all of these depended on maritime transport that made the economics of long-distance trade viable. At a civilizational level, maritime capability determined which cultures could project power, establish colonies, and participate in the exchange networks that accelerated technological and cultural development across regions. The civilizations that developed sophisticated maritime traditions, Phoenicia, Greece, the Austronesian cultures of the Pacific, the Arab trading cultures of the Indian Ocean, the Viking cultures of the North Atlantic, consistently showed the characteristics of accelerated exchange. More diverse material cultures, faster technological development, broader language dispersal, and wider political influence than comparable land-based cultures. At the deepest level, the boat was what made the Earth fully accessible to human settlement. The continents that could not be reached by land, Australia, the Americas for much of the dispersal period, the Pacific Islands, were reached by water, using watercraft developed from that first moment of buoyancy observation at a river's edge. The person at the riverbank reaching for the log couldn't have known any of this. They wanted to get to the food on the other side. They had a problem, an available material, and the cognitive capacity to see the connection. From that moment, unrecorded, unknown, irretrievably lost in time, every ship that has ever sailed ultimately descends. The log is still the boat. We've just had a very long time to improve it.